Welcome to the 35th meeting this year of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Remember and switch off your mobile phones and so on, because leaving them in flight mode can affect the sound. Agenda item 1 is subordinate legislation. First item today is the committee to consider 2 negative instruments: the Animal Byproducts Enforcement Scotland Regulations 2013 and the Rural Development Contracts Land Managers Options Scotland Amendments Regulations 2013. Members should note that no motion to annul has been received in relation to these instruments, as was hinted in the first paper, but we've got that typo corrected. I refer members to the paper. Are there any comments that committee members wish to make on either? If there are none, then we're happy to pass these on. Thank you. Thank you. Agenda item 2, Wildlife Crime in Scotland, 2012 Annual Report. So our second item today is taking evidence from the Minister on wildlife crime in Scotland in the 2012 Annual Report. I welcome to you and your team, Minister. Hugh Dignan, Wildlife Management Head of Branch. Hello. And Karen Hunter, Wildlife Management Policy Officer, Scottish Government. Hello. I refer members to the paper which we have prepared as background, and I would ask the Minister if he wishes to make any opening statement.
I would, Convener, if that's possible.
Please do.
Thank you, Convener. I'm pleased to be here today to give you more information on Scotland and indeed the UK's first ever annual report into wildlife crime. The 2011 Wildlife and Natural Environment Scotland Act introduced the requirement for the Scottish Government to lay an annual report before Parliament into the extent of wildlife crime. The publication of this first report serves as a reminder of the importance of doing everything we can to challenge a crime that not only affects our environment, our wildlife and our well-being, but our global reputation as a destination for wildlife tourism, and we are leading the way on this issue in Scotland. This and future reports will develop into a data series that will highlight trends and developments and what action is being taken. It will provide greater clarity year on year and guide action for the Partnership for Action Against Wildlife Crime, or PAW Scotland. The report includes court proceedings for wildlife crime offences over the last 5 years, police recorded crimes for the last 5 years, recent legislative changes and the future direction of wildlife crime policy. Data from the Justice Department, Crown Office, Police Scotland and the National Wildlife Crime Unit have been collated to paint a picture. And I've been careful to emphasise that whilst it would be ideal if we could track each case from discovery through detection, prosecution and then court disposal, the justice system simply don't allow that at the moment, the justice system data. Each of the data sets records a different aspect of a case. Some data relate to crimes recorded, other data relate to offences prosecuted. There could be several of these in relation to any one incident. Similarly, data can refer to the accused who might have faced charges in relation to offences in addition to wildlife crimes such as vehicle or firearm-related charges. We know that at present the data do not capture all wildlife crime, but we will strive to work with colleagues to improve the intelligence networks and to encourage crime reporting so that future data provide the clearest possible picture. The Act which brought about the annual report also strengthened our wildlife laws with the introduction of the new vicarious liability provisions. These represent a groundbreaking approach to dealing with the bird of prey persecution, and while the new provisions have not yet been tested in the courts, I am confident that if and when the circumstances arise, law enforcement colleagues will not hesitate to pursue a vicarious liability case. The Scottish Government has made tackling wildlife crime a priority since 2007. We published the Natural Justice Report in 2008, which led to the building up of the PAW Scotland organisation. We have financed wildlife crime community projects and the National Wildlife Crime Unit. We have developed a partnership approach which has seen a significant reduction in raptor poisoning from 30 in 2009 to 3 in 2012. We have supported the development and use of world-leading forensic and DNA capabilities to help tackle wildlife crime here in Scotland and in relation to international issues such as rhino horn and ivory smuggling. Robust legislation must be supported by good enforcement. Police reform delivered a strengthened wildlife crime officer network. In every division, there are supporting senior officers liaison officers and wildlife crime officers. And in addition, there is a central coordinator who is a national liaison point and key contributor to PAW Scotland itself. The Crown Office has a dedicated unit dealing with the wildlife and environmental crime, again with advice on hand from Senior Crown Counsel and the high-profile support of the Lord Advocate. And it goes without saying that we cannot afford to be complacent. We know there is still an unacceptable level of bird of prey persecution, and my announcement of further measures in July will tackle that issue. I will put this very simply. I will not accept a drop in poisoning figures of birds of prey as evidence that we have yet won the war on raptor crimes. There is no acceptable level of crime that we must tolerate, and I have already made this clear on several occasions. And I want to see all forms of persecution eliminated from the countryside and those carrying it out brought to account through the criminal justice system. There is no excuse for illegal raptor persecution, and I reiterate that when species conflicts exist, land managers can work with SNH to ensure they can access support to manage any such pressures. And wildlife crime is, of course, much more than just raptor persecution. Crimes involving deer, badgers, hares, freshwater pearl mussels, songbirds and other species also remain far too prevalent. And I want to take this chance today to reiterate a further point I made in the press release which accompanied the report. Underlying each and every statistic are wildlife offences which can often entail cruelty and suffering. I find it extremely depressing that in this day and age, illegal and inhumane treatment of our wildlife remains, and it is a blight on any civilised nation by a selfish and ignorant minority. We are coming to the end of the Year of Natural Scotland, so this report is timely. I will continue to work with others to deliver improving reporting in this area with the aim of reducing and eliminating wildlife crime. This will take time and effort from all involved, and I'm not under any illusion that change will happen overnight. But there are areas in which we are seeing encouraging progress, such as the development of Wildlife Estates Scotland initiative and also action by Scottish Gamekeepers Association and Scottish Land and Estates to expel and ostracise those found guilty of offences. And this should send a strong signal to others. I am, however, confident that actions the Scottish Government has delivered to date, including the publication of this report, will help to protect and secure our wildlife's future. And I look forward to answering your questions on the annual report.
Thank you very much, Minister. So we're open to questions then. Sounds like Graham Day and then Jim Hume. Okay.
Thank you, Minister. Can I refer you to page 20 of the report and the bottom section of it? There's a section there that talks of the various initiatives to combat poaching being underway or being considered. Looking at the bullet points that follow, could you tell us which are actually underway, which are still under consideration, and with the ones that are underway, if there's any sort of progress you can report on?
If I may, Convener, with due regard to Graham Day's point, just direct this point to Karen Hunter.
The Scottish Government doesn't sit on the poaching group as such, but the vast majority of these are underway. The hare coursing issues are... the aid memoirs are in the process of getting published and handed out across stakeholders. Awareness raising is being carried out with different forces.
Well, we can come back if it would be helpful. We can come back with a definite position each of them. That would be helpful, Convener. But I appreciate the point that Mr. Day is wanting to know.
There's a couple of items there.
I'd particularly like to return to hare coursing later in the discussion,
Okay.
if that's possible.
Yeah, indeed, certainly. Jim Hume.
Thanks very much, and good morning, Minister.
Morning.
You mentioned that there's a wildlife police officer in every division. I wonder how that compares to when we had a wildlife police officer in every police force, board region, as was. And also, there were calls before, and I think maybe a previous minister stated that they would look into, as part of police training, for all police to have some amount of training regarding wildlife crime. Is there any progress with that? And if you could explain the difference between having a police officer in a division geographically and the difference between what we used to have as a police wildlife officer in each board region.
Well, my understanding, Mr. Hume, is that there has been an increase in the overall number of officers that are involved with wildlife crime. So we have now 14 officers at sort of a divisional level who have a responsibility for wildlife crime in their area. What has been a recent step is that there was a, if you like, there was a gap between the officers delivering wildlife crime activity on the ground and the senior management through Malcolm Graham, who's representing the specialist units on the Police Scotland board level. There was a kind of a gap in terms of middle management. So I'm really pleased that Malcolm Graham has put in place provision so that there will be a sort of middle ranking sort of senior officer in each force area that will have a responsibility for coordinating the activities of the wildlife crime officers in their area. So I think that's an important step forward. So initially, when Police Scotland was formed, that wasn't there. Malcolm Graham has responded to the apparent need for that kind of linkage to be made between the senior board and himself in representing the specialist units and the officers on the ground. So I'm really pleased that's a step forward. But my understanding is the overall number of officers has increased. And on the training point, it's a point that's been well recognised. In the early days, I think there was quite a lot of activity with police trainees who were going through the probationary period, were given training on wildlife crime issues, and that has waned a little. But now the police are, through something we discussed at the last POS Scotland meeting, the police are looking at using modern technology to have sort of interactive tools to be able to make sure that every officer has some exposure to an understanding of what constitutes a wildlife crime and what kind of evidence is required in order to demonstrate a wildlife crime has been committed. So I think that's an important step forward. But I don't know whether Hugh Dignan might be closer to the detail of what that might cover. I don't know whether you want to say anything more, Hugh, on that.
Yeah, one thing that I would make clear about the 14 officers in every division is those particular roles are liaison roles. So in addition to those liaison officers who are in place in each and every division, there are also wildlife crime officers who are on the ground, who it's part of their daily portfolio of responsibilities. They are the people, the guys and the women who are out there dealing with wildlife crime on the ground, and they have to support them. They have the liaison officer in their division, and they also now have the support of senior officers within in their division, as well as the central coordination. So that's where the 14 officers fits in. I don't have anything further to add to what the Minister said about the new approach to ensuring that all police officers who are coming into Police Scotland have some exposure to wildlife crime legislation and training, but that is a new development, and we're very pleased to see that happening.
Could we add one further thing, if I may, Convener, just to that? It's just that it may be kind of an obvious point, but now there is a single police force. The 14 officers can, where there's a big operation, they can coordinate their efforts and maybe support colleagues in what would have previously been a separate force area. They can actually now work together. If there's an incident, say, in Grampian, the former Grampian area, then officers from elsewhere can come in and support in helping with that investigation.
Supplementary by Graham Day and then Cara Hilton.
Thank you. And just to develop the point that Jim Hume embarked upon, unfortunately in the area I represent is extremely well served by the police in terms of tackling wildlife crime. By tradition, Tayside has been the gold standard of dealing with this issue. But beyond that, the local community officers are very much engaged, those who cover the rural areas. And just as recently as last week, a new Poacher Watch initiative was launched involving gamekeepers, farmers. I just wonder, to what extent is these best practice or those best practice examples being shared across the police force in Scotland to ensure that we really are addressing this issue?
Well, if I can first of all welcome that initiative, I think that's a particularly good example, and we do have, I think, through POS Scotland, an opportunity to share best practice, and certainly when we've got the individual work strands that are looking at, for example, poaching, they can report back on initiatives that have been deployed at a local area in say, Tayside, and that might stimulate local other partners to say, well, actually, we need to do that in Dumfries and Galloway, or we need to do that in Highland. So I think it's a very good forum for sharing that information. Obviously, the idea is to disseminate that out to colleagues across, in this case, perhaps the police and the gamekeepers are obviously represented in POS Scotland, so they will know themselves if there's something good happening with their network, and they can share that experience with other partners at POS Scotland. So I think certainly recognise the value of that work, the importance of sharing it and making sure that if initiatives do work, that it's rolled out elsewhere where there might be a similar challenge, and we can sort of look at and how we can enhance that. But certainly the media strand of POS Scotland is also very good. We've got Louise Batcher, who's a very experienced journalist and very passionate about environment, who's involved in helping us disseminate messages out to the wider community. And I think that's working particularly well. And actually that model could be deployed in other parts of our engagement with stakeholders, actually having some media professionalism involved in working groups, whether it's in relation to biodiversity or indeed agriculture and other sectors. You know, you could see the role for having someone who knows how to get across, you know, when there's actually progress being made.
Cara Hilton.
I was pleased to hear that the role of the wildlife crime officers will continue with the single police force. I have to say I've personally got some concerns about that. Firstly, do you think that there's a link between wildlife crime and organised criminal activity? I know this is a big issue in Fife. In fact, in Fife has seen 300 incidents of wildlife crime last year, which represented an increase of about 800%, and that was a real big concern. And I know the wildlife crime officer in Fife is concerned about the links with organised criminal activity. And I'm also particularly concerned that wildlife crime is becoming increasingly an urban problem as well. And what sort of measures do we have to recognise that fact when we're tackling wildlife crime?
Well, first of all, kind of welcome to the committee. It's the first time to engage with you, Cara, and Cara Hilton. You know, it's an important issue. I think we are finding that there are particular types of wildlife crime, whether it's, you know, hare coursing, you know, badger baiting, where it's some sort of perverse sport, that people are making serious money out of the kind of gambling and that kind of arrangement. So it is certainly something that police are aware of. It's something that we take particularly seriously. There are other areas of wildlife crime which potentially have links to organised crime in terms of the international trade in illegal products such as, you know, ivory from elephants, rhino horn, egg theft. So there are, and stealing, you know, live raptors for trade through, you know, CITES, this sort of CITES provisions. So it clearly is an area where there's quite a lot of concern about the links to organised crime, and like other parts of my portfolio which are butting up against this issue with the waste sector and other areas, it's something that we take very seriously. It's something that the Lord Advocate is very keen to clamp down on and is very supportive of our efforts on wildlife crime. We have now got a dedicated team within a specialist team within the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service that specialises in wildlife crime, because it is a very technical area of the law, and you need to build up that expertise and experience to be able to successfully prosecute a crime. And we are dealing with people who are, if we do come up against organised criminals, who are quite well resourced in terms of their own ability to fund a defence. So we need to have very well trained and very aware legal professionals who can tackle it. So it's something that's taken very, very seriously. I haven't looked specifically at the issues in Fife, but if there's a particular case, I'm happy to correspond or meet with the member to talk about what we can do in the context of Fife. But it's something that I personally take very seriously, and I know the government through the Lord Advocate is very keen to clamp down on any links to environmental crime from the organised criminal community.
Nigel Dawn.
Good morning.
I can go back to the Health and Safety at Work Act and reflect that that was a step change in the way industry organised itself, because suddenly the guys in the boardroom thought they might be responsible and they suddenly realised that they should do something. I'm wondering whether there's any evidence, Minister, that the potential or the prospect of vicarious liability has actually changed the way estate managers and indeed any other business managers actually conduct their business in this context, please.
Well, anecdotally, it would appear to be the case. I mean, certainly we know that individual states have made comments to us to the effect that they are, you know, concerned about this, and to ensure that their staff are appropriately trained, so that they can demonstrate that they have taken every step to ensure that the staff are trained in what their legal responsibilities are. So certainly the reputational driver, the threat, if you like, of being hauled in front of the Sheriff Court is something that I know estates are taking seriously. That's what SLE members tell us in terms of the policy team at SLE. They tell us that they think it's having an effect, and that it is helping to reinforce the message that wildlife crime is unacceptable. So I think there has been genuine progress there. In terms of definitive statistics to prove it, I don't know whether Hugh would want to add anything to that effect, but my understanding is it is having some effect. And while we haven't had a vicarious liability prosecution, I have every confidence, as I said in my opening statement, that if the evidence is there, that the Police and Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service will use that power, and until it's tested in the courts, we won't be able to be definitive about how successful a prosecution will be, but certainly there's a recognition that if a suitable case comes up, that we need to pursue that. But
I don't think there's any data available on people's changes in their behaviour, but one point that I would make is that we did cooperate very closely with Scottish Land and Estates in producing guidance for their members and helping their members understand what due diligence and taking all reasonable steps to prevent that wildlife crime taking place on the ground, what that would entail. And that, I think, was fairly clear evidence of their intention to ensure that they got good cooperation and good...
I'm wondering, Kevin, whether I could go to the other side, though, and recognise that much wildlife crime has nothing to do with those who are employed on estates, but actually comes to the estate in terms of other people coming in. This might be a slightly unfair question because I recognise the Minister is not a lawyer, but nonetheless, this is what we do in this place. Does the Minister believe, or could he consider and reflect on whether or not the law is actually sufficiently well written to enable us actually to catch and prosecute people? Because sometimes the law of evidence just needs to be changed. Because in certain circumstances, I don't want to get into corroboration and all the other sort of high-level stuff, but sometimes you're just not going to be able to use the normal rules and ways of doing things for a particular case and a particular issue. And I'm wondering whether anybody's reflected on whether some of the issues, for example, hare coursing might be one, where the normal rules of evidence might be almost inapplicable. Might just not be possible to do it, and therefore maybe we need to reflect on rewriting the law so that we can cover a particular issue.
Well, certainly, Convener, I'm well aware that this is such a technical area, hence the importance of having the Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, who are best placed to determine what kind of charge can be brought and whether a case for vicarious liability, for example, could be taken forward. I don't want to sort of second guess what they do, but they certainly have, I know, sort of taken these sort of matters into account whenever they've been making a prosecution as to what's the most likely means by which we can secure the outcome that is desired in order to redress a criminal activity of one kind or another. When it comes to looking at the law, clearly I think there will be a time when we have to look back on the provisions in the Wayne Act and see whether they are effective or not. I don't think we're there yet, and it'd be a point we need to try taking forward a vicarious liability case, and the only real test will be taking it to the courts and seeing what learned gentlemen and ladies can make of the case. But I take the point on board. Certainly when it comes to pursuing a wildlife crime, it's worth bearing in mind that you're still requiring the same burden of proof in a wildlife crime. It is a crime. It may not be in many people's eyes as serious as a murder, but the requirement to have the same evidential trail and the proof, the absolute proof that someone has committed a crime is just as important in wildlife crime as any other kind of crime. And it is difficult because we are talking about offences that are often being committed in very remote locations with nobody as a eyewitness to the crime. And so we have to work extremely hard on developing the evidential tools that will allow us to pursue such an offence if one comes to light. So there's a lot of work going on. There's ongoing discussions that the Lord Advocate has had with his team and also within Police Scotland about how we develop the evidential trail and how we can best demonstrate where a crime has taken place. It is very, very tricky, and I acknowledge that, and we have to be responsible and make sure that if there is a prosecution, that we can be sure it's the individual that we're charging has done the crime, and it is very difficult. So it's a sensitive area, clearly, but I would certainly welcome any thoughts the committee have about the the process going forward about reviewing such legislation, but I'll wait to see what you make of that. But I recognise the challenge, and certainly I'll keep alert to any developments. If it proves that the legislation is defective in any way, then clearly there would be an appetite on my part to address that.
Before we come to a separate point, supplementary from Graham Day on this one.
Thank you, Convener. I certainly know from my own constituency the significance of this issue and the difficulty that comes, the practical difficulties in obtaining successful prosecutions. You know, I hear stories about gamekeepers, farmers, and indeed the police encountering these sorts of individuals and finding quite a bold response, a belief that you're never going to be able to prosecute us, so go away type of attitude. But it has been suggested to me, Minister, that perhaps there's another way to do this, which is it possible to look at restricting the ability of these people to have their dogs running free in these areas where hare coursing is going on? That if they had to be kept on the lead, it would provide a preventative means of addressing this. I don't know if that's achievable or not, but it's been an idea put to me by some of the people at the sharp end of this.
Certainly, as Mr. Don has already identified, I'm not a lawyer, so I'd have to look at what is legally possible. But I know in responsibility, another part of my portfolio, clearly I've got responsibility for national parks, and I know they're having to put in place bylaws in East Loch Lomond, for example, to control certain unacceptable behaviours which have threatened conservation issues in that area. So I don't know whether there's possibility of bylaws that might be applied in certain circumstances by a local authority or other partner, but we can certainly come back to committee on that point as to what we could do, unless Mr Dignan or Ms Hunter want to comment on it. I'm assuming it's maybe one that we need to come back to as to what tools we might be able to suggest would work in that situation. But clearly, there is legislation which permits access, but it has to be delivered responsibly. And I think that we have to there's probably a wider message about communication to the public in general, where maybe there's not a wildlife crime being intended, but generally people are going about their business in the countryside unaware that what they're doing is actually potentially risking effectively a conservation risk to a species in an area like Capercaillie, for example, being an obvious example. It can be significantly disturbed by the presence of dogs off leads. And so we probably have a job as a government and Parliament and civic society to get across the message that the Outdoor Access Code is every bit as important as people having rights under the Land Reform Act. So you've got to get both sides of the message across to people that yes, you have a right to roam, but you also have a responsibility to do it in a responsible and mature way, and keep your dog on a lead in appropriate areas.
Just before we move on, in any cases of prosecution, have there been any notes because that whether the estates concerned where these prosecutions have taken place are actually members of Scottish Land and Estates or not? Because part of the anecdotal evidence is that they're often not.
Well, certainly it's been a point being made to me before that there are a number of offences being committed by non-SLE members, or at least is suggested being committed by non-SLE members, and hence I highlighted that I think it's really important as well that there's an element of a peer pressure applied by SLE and other organisations, and I really welcome the fact that Scottish Gamekeepers Association and indeed SLE have ejected people once they're found guilty of an offence. Obviously, I'm sure there are people that put pressure on them to eject them before they've been found guilty, but I don't understand the reason of waiting until they have been proven to be guilty or otherwise before ejecting them. And I think that's a welcome step, because it does send a message to those other members of their organisation. Actually, this is no longer tolerated by SGA and SLE. And I think that's a very positive move they've made to take it seriously enough to throw people out of their organisation. I think it's quite a big step for them, and I certainly recognise that and welcome it.
Alec Ferguson on that point.
Well, it is an extension of that point, if I may, Convener, because I found it interesting, the Minister quite rightly said in his opening remarks that you do not view the reduction in the rate of particularly raptor persecution as a sign that the battle is over, the war is won. And I would entirely agree with that, but nonetheless I'm sure you'd welcome that statistic. And I think give credit to stakeholders such as the Scottish Gamekeepers Association and SLE for the part they've played in that, because without their buy-in it's not going to happen. And it's quite clearly we've got that buy-in, and that's to be hugely welcomed. And the point I wanted to just ask you about is that in written submission that SLE gave us for this session. They point at the end to what they consider to be a gap in the report. And I find it quite an interesting one because their buy-in, as I just say, and I don't think anybody would disagree, is hugely important to the outcome of this legislation. And what they're saying, they believe that there's another increasing group of wildlife crime, which is not yet recorded in the report, or included in the report, which is an increasing incidence of interference with and damage to traps and snares and other items that they quite legitimately use in the protection and the daily going about their jobs. And I just wondered whether you've got any thoughts on how that aspect to this might be addressed in future.
It's something that has been raised with me directly when I've met with members of Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust and SGA and SLE. That they have a concern. It's important to stress for those that might be tampering with such traps and snares. And I can understand the rationale. They might, in some cases, people might think they're doing the right thing to stop an animal being caught in a trap, but actually it could be potentially very damaging to maybe end up catching the wrong kind of animal by tampering with a trap. They might move it or end up trapping a species which wasn't intended to be caught by the snare or trap. They could potentially damage the evidential trail if there was actually a wildlife crime about to be committed, and they could tamper it and muddy the water so it's impossible to actually secure prosecution. So while I understand the motivation, not necessarily agreeing with it, but I understand the motivation for people to do this, I think it could actually be counterproductive. And I think the point that SLE have made to us and SGA have made that obviously with the provisions there are for legal snaring, that they're doing something within the law, and therefore someone comes along and tampers, they could end up in a situation where they're being prosecuted for something that looks like it's they've inappropriately placed a snare or a trap, and actually it wasn't them that moved it. So it does make it very difficult, I think, and puts perhaps an unfair puts them in an unfair position. So I would just encourage those that are considering doing such things to not do so, to leave prosecution of wildlife crime to the police and the professionals who can gather the evidence in a robust way and secure prosecution if that is necessary. So if in doubt, leave the traps in place, and if you've got a concern, really, they can report it. And there's the new Wildlife Crime app that Paul Scotland developed, and the trap and snare might be perfectly legitimately there. If people got any doubt, they can send that information in via the app and let a policeman or another professional come out and assess whether that's an appropriate place for it to be, and just leave it in situ.
You'd recognise that as a legitimate concern?
It is. It's something that Paul Scotland will be addressing. We've raised it in the last meeting. It's something that will come back, I think, on in the next agenda or in a subsequent meeting. So we recognise it's an issue that it's a legitimate point to discuss as to how big a problem it is. We don't have any data, unfortunately, that can tell us how extensive the problem is on a national basis. So we are reliant on SLE and SGA members to tell us what's happening. They have encouraged people to inform the police if there has been any tampering with traps. So I think that was the suggestion they made, that they would make sure it was reported in. If they felt something had been tampered with, they would report that to the police, so they were aware if subsequently there was a wildlife crime that there was an issue in that particular site, and they might take that into account. But it's something we'll come back to discuss at Post Scotland level.
Thank you very much.
Another from Angus MacDonald here, another supplementary on this point, and I have one as well.
Thanks, Convener. Thanks, Convener.
Mr. Lyle,
following
the mute button will be hit.
Following up on Alex Ferguson's point, clearly while animal rights enthusiasts or activists are well-meaning, they can sometimes do more damage than good, especially when it does involve tampering with traps. Clearly, there could be incidences of malicious claims towards estate owners. Has there been any evidence of estates being set up, for want of a better word? And if that's the case, how can that be addressed?
I'm not personally aware of any such evidence of an estate being set up in that way. I fully recognise there's a possibility that could happen, and hence I think it's very important that activists and others who might be considering tampering with material just don't do it, because we need to have a clarity, if you like, as to who has been responsible for laying a trap or laying poison or some other offence illegally. Because I should stress that, you know, it's obviously there are legal ways in which people can use traps and snares, but it's looking for that illegal activity. But I may just ask Hugh Dignan, if I may convene, just as to whether he's aware of any evidence of this having happened previously, been recorded as an offence.
No, I'm not aware of any evidence or any cases where anyone has. I think there have been claims that evidence has been planted or things have happened in an untoward fashion, but I'm not aware of any prosecutions that have gone ahead on the basis of those, or anyone who's got, you know, able to point to any cases that have happened along those lines. One thing that I would add is, further to what the Minister was saying about the whole business of interference with legally set traps, is I understand that BASC, the British Association of Shooting Conservation, are carrying out some research into the incidence of that happening, and that is research which they've asked us if we'll consider supporting, and we are looking at that at the moment, and I think it's very likely we'll be able to offer some sort of support to help with that, to establish the extent to which this is going on in the countryside.
So therefore, Minister, the sentence in the SLE report that says there is an assumption among some animal rights enthusiasts that any such device is inhuman or illegal and they can break or move it with impunity cannot at the moment be proved, and that therefore the report which Hugh Dignan talks about will be quite important to actually establish the facts here.
Yes, I think it's all conjecture at this point. You know, I can understand why SLE might think that's happening in some cases if that's what's being reported to them by gamekeepers, that they didn't tamper with it, or they didn't move the trap and they feel somebody else moved it. It's equally true that we've no proof as to who did it, so to point the finger of blame at the animal rights activists is unfair at this point as well. Until we've got evidence one way or other as to what's happening, it's conjecture on our parts and supposition. But we do need to get more evidence so we can define how big a problem it is, whether it's a legitimate issue that's muddying the waters in terms of prosecution of wildlife crime, or it's very concentrated in one or two sites. So we just generally don't know. But I can understand, and I can certainly recognise the potential for it to be a problem, but we just don't know whether it's an actual problem or just purely a potential one.
It'll be very interesting to know, but anyone who's listening out there on any side of this argument had better take note. Dick Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Minister. Can I ask you to come back to the point of court proceedings and prosecutions? Basically, as you said, it's, and I quote, "These are not a few people taking one for the pot. It involves very unpleasant criminals, and the police deserve a high level of support to deal with them." But I noticed there were only 39 court proceedings in 2012 for the poaching deer, fish and illegal hare coursing, of which only 22 achieved guilty verdicts. Do you have any concerns about the number of prosecutions, and whilst you're not a lawyer, prosecutions that are taking place? Are you having discussions with the Crown Prosecution Office to see what the number of reported crimes are, what the number are going to prosecution that can stand up when we realise that, you know, they have to stand up for prosecution? And do we have any idea of what sentences at the end of the day are imposed in these 22 guilty verdicts? Is it a £20 fine or a £1,000 fine or 30 days imprisonment? Have we any idea?
Well, sorry, there's a number of points there. I think the first point is to recognise that we are aware that we want to strengthen our ability to prosecute a crime where we believe a crime has taken place. With a bit, I feel like our gut instincts, our best instincts are that a crime has taken place. We want to have the appropriate evidence and the ability to prosecute a crime where that is suspected. And hence, there's a lot of emphasis going to have to go in trying to improve the evidential trail so we can take a case to court and the Crown Office can feel sufficiently confident that they can secure conviction if one does go to court. So there's the element of the work that Police Scotland are already doing, and POS Scotland, is a good forum for discussing these issues about how we can improve the evidential trail there's the guidance from the Lord Advocate to Crown Office, Procurator, Fiscal Service, and indeed through them to the police community, to use all investigatory tools that are available to them, and you know, that you know, has sent quite a clear message, I think, and the Lord Advocate has demonstrated his own commitment to tackling this area of crime. So I think, if you like, the strategic message is now being strengthened, that we want to bear down on this. I think it should be seen in the context of an increasing understanding, not only of this being intrinsically a good thing to do in terms of tackling wildlife crime, but also the importance of the natural environment to our economy, as our understanding of the ecosystem services in nature, and also particular some aspects of that in terms of the importance to tourism, importance to our food and drink, our international reputation as well. I think there's a recognition at the highest level within the legal community now that this is something that is, it's not a matter of life or death for mankind, clearly, but it is something that is very, very serious. For the reasons that Cara Hilton identified, there are obviously unsavoury characters involved in some aspects of crime, and we have to bear down on this area of crime. So that's been taken very seriously, and I have no doubt about that in terms of the Lord Advocate and the Crown Office, Procurator, Fiscal Service, and they have made a commitment in terms of putting the specialist team in place. So I would hope to see progress over time. It's also worth pointing out there are some crimes which are committed, as I said in my opening statement, which the route by which the prosecution is ultimately achieved is maybe through a firearm offence or another category of offence, rather than the pure wildlife crime element. But undoubtedly wildlife crime was involved in the activities of the individual, but that's not the conviction that's secured, and therefore it wouldn't appear in the table. So we're not saying this document necessarily captures everything, because there are these kind of hidden wildlife crimes that where someone's prosecuted for something else, it doesn't then appear in the statistics in a helpful way. But we are hoping to refine the data and get a better understanding of where wildlife crime is associated with an offender who's prosecuted for something else, so we can get a better picture as to just how extensive wildlife crime is. And a good example of data recording is, I think just Karen was just explaining to me earlier on that I think the particular issue in Fife might have been a problem with the data, the quality of the data, and so there's been an apparent jump. And we'll come back to you with some specifics on this, but there seems to be an apparent jump, and that's a good example. Just the understanding of what is actually being committed on the ground is improving as we go along, and we're getting better handle on the statistics. But I would hope to get to a situation where there weren't any necessary prosecutions at all. If we could eliminate wildlife crime, we wouldn't have to take people. So it's not a good thing to have lots of cases going to the court. But what I would, in answer to Richard Lyle's point, want to see is a better ability to secure a conviction where we suspect a crime has taken place. So I would like to see a, you know,
have we any idea at all? You can write back to committee. I'd be interested to know what the level of fine, or even being jailed for X amount of days for a particular crime. It would be interesting to see that, whether that level is where it should be, rather than a small fine.
Sorry to interrupt. I mean, we have got an ongoing kind of review, if you like, of wildlife crime penalties and whether they're severe enough. I mean, we have, I'm just getting the gentleman's title, is it Professor Posty? Mark Posty, who's it's not yet been appointed, but we are proposing to have a review of wildlife penalties as to whether they are acting as a significant deterrent enough or not. And that will be led by Professor Mark Posty, yet to appoint him formally, but that's the direction in which we're headed. And that will then look at the role of penalties and the types of sanctions that are available to the courts as to whether they're sufficiently robust to deter wildlife crime. And it's worth pointing out where we have had successful prosecution. Sometimes a criminal offence has occurred, such in the case of a serious incident regarding freshwater pearl mussels, but it wasn't actually ultimately a wildlife crime that the person was convicted of. We secured a bigger fine, a bigger penalty for that offence by going through a different route. So, we need to kind of have a look at it in the round as to how we get the outcome we want, which is to deter the crime and to see an appropriate level of punishment delivered to the offence.
I would certainly welcome, thank you, Convener, I certainly welcome our uprating of these and a review of these fines in order to ensure that these criminals know that they're going to be hit very, very hard if they're found guilty.
Absolutely, and I'm happy to take up Mr Lyle's point. We will write back to committee with more detail about the review and give the appropriate detail about what we propose to do in that regard.
And the very patient Claudia Beamish.
put in an impatient or patient?
Not an impatient.
Good morning, Minister.
Morning.
Could I ask you, really building on previous questions, two specific questions. One about remote areas of Scotland, and that is about partnership working, because I know there's good work going on within the evidence gathering and also vigilance between the police and RSPB and other bodies, and indeed reporting by the general public, as you've highlighted. But could you say a bit more about how that interrelation between the different groups works? Whether that's reported within the PAWS groups. And the other question is actually because of something that's been drawn to my attention by the League Against Cruel Sports, which actually had a reception in the Parliament last night, as you'll know. And this was about the use by what, in fact, Scottish Land and Estates refers to as very unpleasant criminals, the use of the social media. Perhaps more in urban areas in relation to any illegal gatherings about such things as badger baiting and fighting with dogs. And although they may not be wildlife, it's within the wildlife crime categories, I think. So if you could say something about that and any monitoring that's going on with that, although of course I realise that it may be an operational issue.
Well, indeed, I mean, I wouldn't want to kind of alert those who might be doing something to the means by which they might be caught. But suffice to say, we are encouraging through Lord Advocate and indeed Police Scotland colleagues the deployment of all investigative tools. And I think responding to changes in behaviours and the means by which people communicate, I would imagine that would be something that the police will be well aware of and will take appropriate action to try and use any intelligence that they can gather through perhaps more modern and means of communication and social media to investigate criminal offences. Certainly in terms of the kind of collaboration that's going on, Claudia Beamish is absolutely right that predominantly, although I take the point about urban crimes that was raised earlier, that this is an area that's also present in more urban parts of Scotland as well. But many of the crimes are being committed, particularly when you talk about raptor persecution, in very remote parts of Scotland. Freshwater pearl mussels as well is another example. These are very remote parts of Scotland where you don't have many eyes and ears around to witness a crime being conducted. And we do have important resources to the UK-wide National Wildlife Crime Unit and their coordination role that they play in terms of ensuring that partners do work together and gather intelligence and share intelligence. And we found some recent examples where, without using names in pack drill, there was a suspect who had come up from, I think the northwest of England that was suspected to be up in Scotland for purposes of illegal egg collection, and aware of the gentleman's vehicle, his licence plate, and he was tracked all the way up to the Western Isles, and was effectively the incident didn't arise to anything, but having access to that intelligence about his whereabouts and knowing where he was going, he was effectively tracked all the way up to where he ended up and tracked the way back without any crime being committed. So it's just being able to have that intelligence shared, and that's the importance of the National Wildlife Crime Unit is important in that context. It's also worth stressing that the PAWS Scotland group does have a number of important subgroups. I mean, we do have degree of coordination about legislation, regulate. This is all set out in the report, so I'm not going into too much detail. But legislation, regulation, and guidance. There's sort of training, awareness aspects. There's sessions being organised so people understand CITES. Get training from specialists coming up from London to advise police in Scotland and others, stakeholders, as to trends and important developments in relation to policing with CITES requirements. And we have a team looking at the sort of forensics through the sort of science community as well. So there's important work going on there in terms of building the evidence trail, coordinating activities, sharing information. And I think that's one of the big strengths of the PAWS Scotland network, which is something I know has been looked at by other administrations as to a way forward in terms of bringing together all the different agencies to get a coordinated approach to tackling wildlife crime.
Right. Any next questions?
Seek a point of clarification, Convener, if I may. And I really don't want to be seen to be questioning the Minister on any technicality, but he did refer, in an answer to an early question, I think he actually said, we understand there is a right to roam. And I'm sorry if this sounds pernickety, but I think it is actually a right of responsible access. And the only reason I raise it is because it was stressed very heavily at the time that there is a difference. The right of responsible access refers considerable responsibilities on both the access giver and the access taker. So forgive me, Minister, for seeking to correct you, but I think it's important just to
put on the record. I think the point, I used loose language, but I was trying to point out that people have a right to access areas of the countryside, but they have to do it responsibly and they have to be mindful of the requirements of the Outdoor Access Code. And it's simply not good enough for people to say, well, I have a right to be here and I can do what the heck I like. That's just not right. So it's just to get the balance that people understand their responsibilities when they are in the countryside. Yes, they have a right to access the countryside, but they have to do it responsibly.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Minister. In July of this year, you introduced some new measures with regard to tackling wildlife crime. I realise it's far too early to be talking about that, but it has been suggested that the 2013 annual report will review the development and impact. When can we expect the 2013 report to come out, and is there anything you can tell us about the direction of travel in this?
Well, certainly in terms of the measures announced in July, the sort of the three elements, just for the record, sort of the restriction of use of general licences, and it's important to stress this is not a punishment, but it's to be borne in mind that general licences are a privilege that people have, and it's something which demonstrates our trust, if you like, in them to act responsibly. So where we have reasons to suspect that there may be need to restrict the use of the general licence, that is something that's an important step which will hopefully help bear down on illegal activity in an area, or at least suspected illegal activity in an area. And that's something that's SNH are working with police to agree the type of evidence that could be provided to justify such a restriction. It's not as strict a level of evidence as you would require for a criminal prosecution. And it's worth stressing that, well, we want to have as much evidence as possible before taking such an important step in relation to what could be an important impact on a landowner or an estate. There have been precedents before where there has been an issue in regard to cross-compliance, for example, for single farm payments, so a similar burden of proof. But we need to wait for SNH and the police to have that discussion and come forward with what evidence they think would be sufficiently robust to justify such a measure. But it is one that I think a step we need to contemplate. On the use of the full range of investigative techniques by the police, for the reason I gave earlier on, I obviously can't say too much about the detail of that, but can confirm that at the first meeting of the new Police Wildlife Crime Liaison Officers Group, both the Lord Advocate and the Assistant Chief Constable, Malcolm Graham, gave their clear backing and encouragement to police officers on the ground to consider all the techniques at their disposal. I'm happy to answer any subsequent questions about that, but certainly that's one that's being proposed. And on the review of penalties, as I say, we'll write back to the committee with more detail on this, but we do now have a chair in mind, Professor Mike Prousty of Strathclyde University, who is an expert in environmental law and has had some involvement, for example, in the Regulatory Reform Bill, and has extensive knowledge of the application of the law in relation to environmental crimes. And other members of the group will come from the law enforcement and land management and environmental communities to make up the team that will review those procedures. And we do expect the work to start in the new year and conclude by next summer, or in next summer. So on the 2013 report itself, I'm kind of hesitant to pin down a timescale, because I know it's still slightly experimental. We've had difficulties. We had difficulties in the publication of the 2012 report in terms of getting us, to a point where we were sufficiently happy about the robustness of the data and its comparability, and work is ongoing on that. But we can come back to the committee when we've got a clear idea as to when it will be published. But I'm conscious of the high level of public interest in the report, and clearly it's one we would want to see each report, if possible, improve on the last. And to further strengthen the report and make it a more useful tool as we go on. But I think the first one was a great start, and as I say, it is a kind of precedent in a UK context, certainly in Scotland. And We want to make sure that it's, the next one is, if anything, an improvement rather than a go backwards. But it's about working with the partners to ensure we've got a sufficiently good quality of data and try and address some of the points that I discussed with Mr Lyle about the visibility of wildlife crime in terms of other offences where maybe it's a secondary or sort of seen as less likely to secure prosecution and therefore not the primary objective of the court case. Thank you.
Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. It's on a separate point.
Good.
All right, thank you. Minister, could I turn our attention to the data in the court proceedings, which is on page 6 of the report, and ask you specifically about the part which refers to hunting with dogs and the legislation being the Protection of Wild Mammals Scotland Act 2002. And it's been drawn to my attention that in 2011-12 there were 5 people who were proceeded against, but there were no prosecutions. And I wonder the degree to which the legislation in this case is robust enough and whether it's going to be reviewed, because what's been pointed out to me is that there is an exemption for allowing foxes to be flushed out by guns, and that if the fox is accidentally killed by hounds before reaching the guns, that it is not the committing of an offence. And I wonder if that bears any relation to the lack of prosecution, or where this fits into it at all.
Well, I have to be honest, Convener, I don't know in the
I
case of
didn't know
that.
anything about it till the reception last night either.
Unless either you or Karen
Yeah.
can enlighten me, it's something I will have to look at and come back to the committee with a response as to what the nature of the difficulty there was in securing a prosecution and a guilty verdict. Clearly, I just put on the record, certainly I'm very strongly opposed to fox hunting, and if there's any suggestion that there's any degree of stretching the boundaries a wee bit to deliver a fox hunting with dogs by the back door, I would look at that very seriously indeed. But I will look at the issue and see if there is something fundamental that we need to address in terms of law. But I just genuinely don't know what the cause of that particular fall off in successful guilty verdicts is, unless either Hugh or Karen can. I don't think. Yeah.
It's correct. Flushing is allowed.
Right. Okay. Apparently, it is allowed. Flushing is allowed, but certainly we'll look at that in case there's any particular issue, suggestion as to being a problem with how the law is defined that's not sufficiently tight enough. I'll give the member a commitment. We'll look at that,
Minister, and associate myself with your view as well on hunting with dogs.
Thank you very much. Oh, Jim Hume wants to ask a question.
On a separate point as well. Cage traps are used, as you'll know, for controlling vermin, such as mink, which is a non-native species, and carrying crow, which can do a lot of environmental damage. The cage traps are even used within this Parliament, as you'll often see now and again outside, to trap some of the feral pigeons that are around. But there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence of cage traps being destroyed. Of course, that results in quite a lot of environmental damage. Is there any evidence of people being persecuted for destroying legal cage traps? And would that be seen as a wildlife crime, or would that be another matter?
Well, I think it's in the same category as the issue that was discussed earlier on in relation to Mr MacDonald's point, that it will be picked up by the Basque study that we were being asked to support. So we will try and define exactly how often this is happening. I recognise it's a potential issue, and clearly there's an issue too that, you know, when a cage trap is not being used, it should be deactivated and left sort of in situ, but, you know, deactivated so it can't be used. But someone could reactivate it without the knowledge of the of landowners. So there's may not just be a case of destruction of the trap, but it may also be, you know, the trap could be set without the knowledge of the gamekeeper or the landowner. So, but it is something we don't have any actual evidence of in terms of statistical evidence. It's merely an anecdotal issue, and people suggesting this might happen. So hopefully the Basque, the piece of work the Basque are keen to do with government support will help define exactly how big a problem that is, if it is a problem at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you, Minister. It's very useful for us to be able to highlight this wildlife crime report, and I think it will become an annual event, if not required in between, which we hope. but it's going to be useful to see some of your written responses so that we can be as well informed and make sure that people out there realise it's a high priority for the Parliament. So thank you very much.
I associate myself with your comments, Convener, and certainly thank the committee for its interest in wildlife crime. It's certainly something I'm sure will be appreciated by members of POS Scotland.
Thank you.
Thank
we'll
you.
Suspend briefly to allow the Minister to leave, and we'll come back to item 3 in public in a wee while. Restart. Committee agenda item 3, public petitions, and our third item today is consideration of the petition PE 01490 by Patrick Krause on behalf of the Scottish Crofting Federation on the control of wild goose numbers. This petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to address the problems created by increasing populations of wild geese in the crofting areas as a matter of priority, reassess its decision to stop funding existing goose management programmes and assign additional resources to crop protection and adaptive management programmes to ensure this threat to the future of crofting is averted. And I refer members to the paper and I invite comments from members on the petition. Angus MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. As members know, I serve on the Public Petitions Committee, and when this petition came to the committee, it was clear that there was a major problem for farmers and crofters in the Western and Northern Isles, and to a lesser extent in Kintyre and Solway. And due to that recognition, we decided to refer this to the Rural Affairs Committee immediately, rather than go through the normal process of approaching ministers through the Public Petitions Committee. We heard extensive evidence that the problem is getting worse, particularly with regard to greylag geese, where we're seeing overspill from the Eusts into Lewis and Harris, and also into Colin Tyree. So, you know, we recognise that crofters are having a difficult enough existence without this added burden. And if I can give the committee an example, on our own family farms in just outside Stornoway, where 20 years ago you would be lucky to see 4 or 5 geese in a field, now there's hundreds, and it's clearly becoming a major concern. Now there's a mixture of different schemes operating in the islands, government-backed schemes at varying costs, and if the committee is minded to write to the Minister, it would be good to get some more information from the government on what more can be done to address this problem, because it's clearly not going to go away until further action is taken.
Well, indeed, we've got a situation now where the monies, have run up into huge sums, but the problem is still with us, and we've got to find some consensus, I hope, in the committee about what we might do to write to the Minister about this, and with suggestions about what to do. So, given the exercise in Orkney, with an attempt to manage the geese and then market some of the product, we need to find some idea of whether that's actually going to be part of a solution, because you have to find out what there's a market for, apart from duvets, as somebody once said. But and indeed, you could see all these flying duvets, as Colin Campbell, the comedian, once talked about, because that's precisely what we've got to try and cope with in places which are being overrun. I don't know if you saw the Hebrides programme, but you saw the problem in Isla there of the masses of geese that are in the area. So Angus has made some points. What about some responses from the rest of the committee? Yep, Graham Dave.
Just taking that point on, Convener, I did read somewhere that I think it's greylag geese are not particularly tasty, but I wonder if there is a use for them as a source of protein. For example, could they be used to feed salmon? Is this kind of stuff being looked at by the government?
Or for pet food, or indeed for human food, at a time when we're desperate for sources of food. We need to know some answers to these questions. Presumably the Orkney situation has meant that there is actually some kind of market, but we don't know how much yet. Dick Lyle?
Yes, Convener, I would certainly agree with the comments that have been made, and also I note that they're saying that Scottish National Heritage is working on a development of a scheme to permit the limited sale. Why limited sale? Is if the problem is as bad as what Angus MacDonald is saying, and the points have been made, and I think we should ask the Minister to investigate whether in fact it can be used as a protein, as Graham Day saying salmon, and as you yourself said, and possibly pet products, and also to sell another way of encouraging another business up there in order to provide employment and income to the relative area.
Could there be an export market, in fact? You wonder whether the issue of getting rid of the deer, I keep saying, we've got deer in the brain.
That was last week.
Geese. Yes, on the horns of a dilemma here. We've got to try and think about the costs that were, incurred with eradication, and at the same time whether there's actually an income. So is there an export market? I wonder.
Convener, can I just say, I think the idea of writing to the Minister is the obvious one, and that's right. All I'm wondering at this stage is whether there's anybody else we should write to, and the obvious answer perhaps in this context might be the councils concerned, who will no doubt have a view on this and might on the timetable we're working on be able to express that view to us, simply so that we get an input from them sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we just have to maybe write to them afterwards.
A small point from Richard Lyle,
Claudia
and Jim.
It may have been a Freudian slip, Convener, but the point I made a couple of weeks ago also was the fact that in regards to venison, that there could be an increased market for it in various areas. I actually checked with my local butcher, who doesn't sell it. And the point I was making then, sorry, I'll be brief. The point I was making then was that it could be an increase in market, an increase in jobs, in order to develop this product and other products throughout Scotland. And Richard Lockhead is I would say, the champion of Scottish food. And I would encourage the ministers to explore what other foods we can market throughout Scotland and export in order to provide jobs and income.
Okay, thank you. Claudia Beamish.
I would just highlight, Convener, that there's the National Goose Management Review from 2010, and that one of the quotes that's been drawn to our attention from that is that the risk that remains that without intervention to control increasing damage, social costs could rise very substantially without any compensatory public benefit. So I do think it's a very important issue. I would also say that once it was in France, but part of the European Union, that for Christmas we did have a goose, and I'm afraid I don't know what type it was, but it was delicious. So there's the possibility, that's just anecdotal. But also I would highlight that while a lot of the populations are increasing with considerable damage to local economies, and that there are some that are declining, and that's been highlighted as the green and white fronted goose as one that's declining. So I just think we need to put that into the equation as well in our considerations.
Yeah, indeed, the pink-foot geese, which are nest in my area, in Caithness in particular, are very much protected, and they gather in very protected areas. But the point is that the vast majority of geese are actually the ones that are called the grey lag geese, and that's what the major problem is about. So we do differentiate in that, I think. Yes, indeed. Jim Hume?
Yeah, I think Claudia was quite right. There are geese and there are geese, obviously, and wouldn't be seen to cull geese that are needing to be supported. But further, just to the point regarding looking for a market for the geese, if there's such a problem, another market is, of course, the wild fowling market. So, it could help the economy by, in a controlled manner, of course, having some sport there.
Yes, indeed. I think that's entirely possible as one of the suggestions we can make. So I think we've got quite a range of suggestions there that we can put in the letter. Maybe Angus wants to sum up from the public petition side.
I was just going to add another couple of suggestions of bodies that we could contact. There's the Crofting Commission, the Scottish Crofting Federation, who submitted the petition in the first place, and possibly the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, to see what they would have to say.
Could I suggest, then, Convener, we're going to look at our forward business on the 11th of December, so could we request responses, if at all possible, ahead of that to inform our deliberations about future business? Is that? I recognise it is tight, but it would allow us to take a look at this as to whether what more we might want to do on this subject.
Indeed, no doubt there'll be a cross-party group in Crofting coming round at the moment, apart from anything else, and a rural one, I think, this week. So there might well be places that we can speak to stakeholders about this. But a letter to the Minister could probably go as a copy to other organisations as well, if that covers the points that was raised by Graham. And I think we've got sufficient bits and pieces of your suggestions for us to try and be proactive on this. Yeah, local authorities and also the Cropling Federation and so on. Nigel?
Just conscious there'll be people watching even now, and I think we've mentioned the RSPB. I'm sure they'd want to put something else in. I mean, it does seem to me if other folk want to send us a letter, we're probably not going to do anything other than read it and welcome whatever information they can give us.
I'd be very surprised if they didn't.
Indeed.
Indeed. Very good. Right, thank you for that. That's sufficient, I think, for us to deal with that. At our next meeting, the committee will hold an evidence session with the Scottish Government officials on the Agricultural Holdings Scotland Act 2003 Remedial Order 2014, and the committee will also consider 2 SSSIs. I now move the meeting into private and ask the public gallery to be cleared, or clear yourself. That's